Managing built-in costs. For most projects, this will be your first real challenge in an overall strategy for cost control beyond design. Built-in costs are the necessary costs that someone will incur when the base building is not ready to be transformed into the intended restaurant. Built-in costs can't be avoided, but they can be managed. But here's the thing. Built-in costs will become baked in, meaning they'll be assigned to one party or the other the moment the lease is signed. Stay on offense. Built-in costs are present in nearly every project. The only time you don't incur them is in a brand new building or a first-generation tenant build-out in a building that was designed for restaurant use. They vary from site to site and building to building, and therefore they need to be taken into account in site selection. And in fact, a qualified site selection specialist will identify, at least generally, the potential built-in costs when a property is initially presented for consideration. There are basically two drivers to built-in costs. One is the age or overall condition of the building, and the other are the costs that will be incurred when a non-restaurant space is converted to restaurant use. Age-related built-in costs are easy to understand, but they may take a trained eye to recognize. One obvious category of age-related built-in cost is extreme deferred maintenance. This typically happens when a space has been occupied by the same tenant for many years or decades. That tenant long ago closed their eyes to parts of the building that they were not concerned about, and the landlord wasn't concerned either. This is where you'll likely find drywall mold in damp areas, or rusted out steel studs and stud tracks, possibly insulation that has completely fallen out of the ceiling cavity. The building exterior may have unchecked cracks in the finish system and may need a complete system of building sealants, primer paint, and finish paint to restore watertight integrity. Another category of age-related built-in costs will be major building components that are at or near the end of their useful life. This can be HVAC components or the roofing system or any number of things. And I've found that there's typically about a 15-year effective usable life for many building components. Beyond that, they may still be functional, but they may require additional maintenance costs to coax them along. Technical obsolescence is another category of age-related built-in costs. There may be some components in the building that are functioning perfectly, but their performance is completely obsolete. This would include things like old single-pane glazing with no low-E coating, or pre-LED lighting systems, or a building envelope that's just not insulated to current standards. In this case, the cost of replacing these systems with current components may be more beneficial than just trying to maintain the obsolete systems. Also, not to be overlooked in older buildings is the possible presence of hazardous materials, asbestos-containing materials, lead paint, etc. It may be necessary to obtain a hazardous materials survey and risk analysis before moving forward with a building. These age-related built-in costs will follow a fairly predictable curve. They'll be zero with the brand new building, and after 5 years with no more than one prior tenant in the space, they'll still be very manageable. They start to increase faster when the building reaches 10 and 15 years of age, and after that the curve increases sharply. The other main driver of built-in costs relates to the conversion of non-restaurant space to restaurant use. These costs generally involve the upgrade of building services and utilities. For example, a restaurant has a higher HVAC demand than the same space as a retail use or an office. This increased requirement for HVAC equipment often triggers a need to enlarge the main electrical service. Similarly, the water service for a retail use or a business office is smaller than what's required for a restaurant. But the largest driver of conversion cost is typically the code upgrades that are required when there's a change of occupancy classification. Every building use is categorized in the building code according to one or another of the main occupancy classification groups. A retail space is classified as a Group M mercantile occupancy, and an office building is classified as a Group B business occupancy. When you convert either of those to a Group A2 assembly occupancy, which is necessary for a restaurant, then virtually every aspect of the code analysis is treated as though this were a brand new building. When you're doing alterations without changing occupancy classification, there's a little bit of leniency in the codes, but that all goes out the window when you change the overall occupancy classification from one to another. The existence of built-in costs is typically not a mystery, whether they're age-related or conversion-related. But the magnitude of those costs may remain a mystery right up until the time the lease is signed. These costs become baked in at that point, and the only way to reassign a cost to the landlord is to re-enter lease negotiations. Those negotiations typically are one way. The tenant is petitioning the landlord for cost assistance on some category of work that they didn't adequately analyze before the lease was signed. Well, that's going to get old real fast for the landlord. The three tactical steps that I recommend for managing built-in costs are to acknowledge, assess, and assign those costs. The reason acknowledge is first in this list is that the person that really needs to acknowledge these costs is the restaurant operator, the potential lessee. Often, a restaurant operator will go all the way to the lease signing with only a vague awareness of these built-in costs. And I think that's due to our bias toward optimism. We all tend to think that we're capable of doing more things than we really are, and that fate will deal us a favorable turn. After all, what's not to be optimistic about? You've got a terrific brand, you've found a fantastic location, you've got a team of investors that are committed to the full project, including a reasonable contingency for cost overruns. So what's not to be optimistic about? Well, signing a lease with unknown baked-in costs is one thing. Once you've acknowledged the built-in costs, the next logical step is to assess them. And this may require hiring some experts to take a look at the building. I have clients that will call me and say, we're looking at a new project, and just as soon as we get the lease signed, we're going to give you a call to start design work. Well, wouldn't it be a whole lot better to invest a little bit of money up front and get some experts out there to help you assess the unknown conditions and the built-in costs? Anything has got to be better than throwing darts at the dartboard in the dark. That was a lot of D's. My point is this: get some help while you can. The third tactical step is to assign these costs, and that begins with having a qualified real estate agent represent you throughout the lease negotiations. It's always a good practice to use a landlord work letter as a lease exhibit, and this holds the landlord accountable to the things that they've agreed to do, to the cost assignments that they have accepted when the lease is signed. One thing is to know the difference between capital improvements and leasehold improvements, and then to push back on the notion that the tenant is going to pay for capital improvements. Capital improvements offer benefit to the owner throughout the life of the building. Leasehold improvements offer benefit to the tenant only for the duration of the lease. And one day, somebody else will come in and tear out everything that you've built and start all over. In order to avoid funding the landlord's capital improvements, it's good to recognize the demising line and not build anything outside of that line. When the need arises for improvements that are outside of the tenant space, these should be a landlord responsibility. These are going to be things like roof repairs or sidewalk repairs in the front, or even the installation of a grease interceptor in the back. When you move out of the building, nobody's going to tear up the grease interceptor and dispose of it. One good reason that the landlord should take care of these improvements outside of the building, aside from the fact that the lease says that the construction activities of the tenant are limited to the demise space, is the fact that the landlord already has access to the architect and the engineers that are responsible for the overall building. It's not a good idea for the restaurant architect to start messing around with the building structure. If the roof needs to be reinforced in order to carry the weight of all the extra restaurant equipment, then a structural engineer working for the owner should take care of that. Also, beware of latent costs for improvements that may now or later be necessary outside of the demised tenant space. An example of this might be ADA improvement costs on the site when an attorney discovers that there are a whole bunch of ramps out there that don't meet ADA. If you've hired your architect and your contractor to repair a deficient ramp that's located outside of your demised tenant space, but there are 7 more similar ramps on the property, how are you going to avoid the vortex of joint and several liability when an ADA lawsuit is filed against the property? Did you have constructive knowledge that all these additional ramps needed to be repaired and you didn't notify the owner and you didn't take any steps on your own to repair them? I'm not an attorney and I don't want there to be any confusion. I'm not offering legal advice. But I am saying it's a good practice and it's entirely consistent with the lease most of the time to limit your construction activities to inside the demised tenant space. Having to perform work outside the demised tenant space can be very often difficult to avoid. This can be true particularly when there's a change of occupancy classification and now every aspect of the building has to be brought up to current codes. The building department will often require as a condition of issuing a building permit that ADA deficiencies that are on the sidewalk or on the site beyond be addressed. I want to take some time to talk about some aspects of federal law that relate to the performance and cost responsibility for ADA improvements. Now, this is not the building code for accessibility. You won't find instructions on how to build or repair a ramp in here. This is administrative law that weighs in on the question of the extent and the responsibility to make these ADA improvements. What you're seeing on the screen right now is an excerpt from the Code of Federal Regulations, 28 CFR 36.403. I have abridged the language that you see by removing some of the federal speak and some of the nomenclature, and I've reduced this down to readable English. Landlord and tenant. Alterations by the tenant in areas that only the tenant occupies do not trigger a path of travel obligation upon the landlord with respect to areas of the facility under the landlord's authority if those areas are not otherwise being altered. What this means is that you, as a tenant, by virtue of applying for a building permit to make interior tenant alterations, did not create or force upon the owner the obligation to make outside improvements. If the need for those improvements is there, it was latent. Well, what do you do if the building department refuses to issue a building permit unless it includes improvement of those exterior site features? If your lease is squared away properly, you inform the landlord of their obligation to make these improvements. This principle is commonly known, that the tenant is only responsible for ADA improvements inside the demised tenant space, and the landlord is responsible for everything outside the tenant space unless something has muddied the water. If the tenant goes ahead and takes the initiative to work outside of the tenant space, then this provision is completely unclear. To proactively solve this problem, you build into the lease a mutual performance and indemnification clause. Something along the lines of the landlord is solely responsible for providing accessibility for the disabled in all areas outside of the demised tenant space, and for producing all necessary documentation to demonstrate compliance with codes and laws related to accessibility. And, of course, the reciprocal is needed, that the tenant is solely responsible for providing accessibility inside the demised tenant space, etc., etc. Again, let me disclaim that I'm not an attorney, and I'm not proposing that this language or any specific language be used in your lease. That's a matter for your own contract attorney to resolve. I'm merely pointing out that a clause in the lease that assigns responsibility and grants indemnity can go a long way toward keeping you out of the responsibility of making ADA improvements outside of the tenant space, even when the building department requires it. At the very least, and as a last resort, if you're going to perform that work using your own architect and contractor, you need a very solid hold harmless clause in the lease from the landlord. I understand that lease negotiations are sensitive, and both parties have a lot to lose if those negotiations break down. But I still encourage restaurant tenants to push back hard against the notion that the tenant should pay for capital improvement costs or that the tenant should make any kind of improvements outside the demised tenant space. This is where you need to stay on offense. And remember, the landlord's lease negotiator also has a personal bias toward optimism. So, use the landlord's optimism as an offensive weapon. After all, it's a great deal for them too, and they don't want to see the ball game get rained out in the first inning. I once read a golf self-help book that included some strategies for wagering on the golf course. And the author said it's always better to bet that your opponent can't make the next shot rather than that you can. And this is how you play on the other party's bias toward optimism. In the case of lease negotiations, that may work out like this. If the building requires a grease interceptor in order to be transformed into a restaurant and it's not there, you initially present to the owner the logic that this is a capital improvement. The grease interceptor is a concrete tank in the ground and it'll last 100 years. Also, if it's true, point out that the lease prevents the tenant from performing construction activities outside of the demised tenant space. And then point out that the building owner's civil engineer is the person with the most data and with a relationship with the building department and by far in the best position to secure the building permit for the grease interceptor. If all this logic fails, and the landlord still insists that it be a tenant responsibility to install the grease interceptor, point out that this is a cost that's above and beyond your project budget. At this point, in order to advance their argument, the landlord's lease negotiator might attempt to minimize this cost. They might say that the known cost of a grease interceptor is $25,000. At that point, it may be wise to hook the landlord to that responsibility at that price. As soon as contractors and engineers start looking into the grease interceptor, its cost is going to go up significantly. You will never hear a lower cost than you do that moment. You may want to offer to pay for it right up to that $25,000 limit. You can build it into the lease or you can agree to write a check, but whatever you do, hook them to make that shot. You're betting that your opponent can't make the next shot rather than that you can. Now the landlord is probably going to turn that around and say, no, we'll give you a $25,000 allowance and you build it. If you accept that allowance, the whole deal has been reversed, and you are now wagering that you can birdie the next hole. That is not consistent with staying on offense. Once you acknowledge and assess and assign the built-in costs, you're going to have to live with the results. And if you have knowingly accepted the assignment of built-in costs that are either capital improvements or improvements outside of the demised tenant space, just be aware that you have just officially approved your first cost overrun, and nobody even gave you a change order. Okay, enough with the tough love. Now I want to give you something that I think may be useful. I realize that deals happen quickly and there's not always time to engage the consultants that are needed to give you a perfect answer. So I want to give you a tool that will roughly estimate your cost exposure for built-in costs in the absence of any other specific cost data. As I stated earlier, there are two categories of drivers for built-in costs. One is the age or general condition of the building, and the other are the conversion costs associated with transforming non-restaurant space into a restaurant. I've created a 4-cell comparison matrix to look at all of the possible combinations of these two drivers. Here's what it looks like. And I want to make a couple of quick notes. The cost risk factors that I'm talking about relate to construction cost only, not to FF&E. The buyout of the FF&E is not dependent upon the condition of the building. And these cost risk factors should not be thought of as the normal contingency to a construction budget. These costs should be built into the budget and then whatever contingency you apply should be on top of that. The cells in the top row, Condition 1 and Condition 2, represent buildings that were intentionally designed for restaurant use with appropriate utilities and roof structural capability, etc., or a building that has been previously successfully transformed into a restaurant. The cell on the left, Condition 1, represents a new or nearly new building, and the cell on the right, Condition number 2, represents a building with some age and multiple turnovers of tenants, generally 12 to 15 years. Beyond 15 years, the costs are probably off this chart because, as I mentioned, they're going to continue to escalate. The cells in the bottom row, Conditions 3 and 4, represent buildings that were not designed for restaurant use or were not previously transformed into a restaurant. Condition 3 represents a new or nearly new building, and Condition 4 represents a building with multiple generations of prior tenants and probably 12 to 15 years of age. To begin this comparison, I've made a list of probable drivers of built-in cost, and it's by no means an exhaustive list, and I park that list into each of the 4 conditions. As we look at them one at a time, I'll highlight with yellow the conditions that I think are probable of being a significant driver in that condition. So when we look at condition number 1, I have nothing highlighted. This is a new or nearly new building that was designed for restaurant use, and there should theoretically be 0 costs. Now, sometimes these buildings might be still fairly new and a second generation space, so there could be a marginal amount of built-in cost, but it really isn't significant in Condition 1. When we look at Condition 2, you'll see that I've highlighted several of the factors with a yellow marker. These are the ones that are likely to be age-related, and I've highlighted the cost risk box in yellow, indicating that there's reason to take caution and take a closer look. In Condition number 3, we cross that barrier, and now we're looking at conversion of non-restaurant to restaurant. And these are more significant than age-related costs. I've highlighted several of those that I think would become of concern in Condition 3, and the overall cost exposure at 10%, I've highlighted in sort of an orange, yellow starting to turn toward red. Condition number 4 now is the accumulation or the compounding effect of both age-related costs and conversion costs. The total risk exposure now is up to about 20%, and it could go higher. I've highlighted that conclusion box in red, indicating that there's definitely something to stop and take a close look at. Sometimes it's even necessary to back away from a deal when those costs are unacceptable. Now, let me state that this is not a scientific study. I don't have enough data points to prove anything. This is strictly anecdotal. It's based on my own career experience of hundreds of projects where I've had a ringside seat for the budget battles, and I've got the scars and bruises to prove it. Now, am I saying that a building in this Condition 4 is likely to have a 20% cost overrun or increase to the budget? Yes, very likely so. If the cost hasn't been anticipated in the original budget, it will most likely creep in and be there in your final cost analysis. So built-in costs are the real deal. They're not imaginary. If unacknowledged, they're a temptation to the tenant who, operating in an extreme state of optimism, may be inclined to sign the lease without ever actually knowing the possible impact of these costs. They're often submerged in the scope. The parts of the project that the landlord should be responsible for represent high beta risk for the tenant. They can represent latent liabilities. Anytime the tenant takes on responsibilities for landlord scope, there are contingent liabilities. I knew a case of a small restaurant operator who petitioned the landlord for relief from the requirement to use the landlord's roofing contractor to make their minor roof repairs. And the landlord granted conditional relief, and so my client employed a contractor who used a lesser quality roofing sub, so to speak. When the work was complete, the first rain came, leaks developed around the tenant's new equipment, and they hit the metal deck and traveled along a bottom trough and crossed over the tenant line and eventually caused water damage in the tenant space next door. Rather than that tenant looking to the landlord for assistance with repair costs, The conditional approval to use a different roofing contractor meant that my client was ultimately responsible not only for the roofing repairs in their tenant space, but for the collateral damage in the adjacent tenant space. Built-in costs are tenacious in the transformation process from a non-restaurant to a restaurant. Built-in costs can be challenging for change orders. If these costs were not recognized by the tenant up front, then they may also be difficult to get their arms around late in the game when the change orders show up. They have the potential to blow up the budget if they're not anticipated up front and built into the budget. Okay, that's a wrap on built-in costs. I believe that to inform is to inspire, and therefore I hope that you will take a much closer look at the impact of built-in costs on your future projects. Acknowledge, assess, and assign. So 3 tactical steps to managing built-in cost. Now you have to acknowledge these costs, and don't be your own worst enemy. You have to manage your optimism. Assess the costs. You don't have your full project team in place, but maybe you need to go ahead and spend a little money and hire a couple of key experts to advise you. Don't wait until you've signed the deal to go find out what the experts could tell you. Assign the costs. You have to get this deal squared away before you sign the lease, and always stay on offense. Coming up next, our important segment on unknown but knowable building conditions. Stick with us.